Since the beginning of civilization, there has been the concept of work, whether it is people being forced to work through terrible conditions for little or no pay, or whether it is people getting paid millions because of a simple idea that nobody has ever thought of. Work was involved through the whole process. With the evolution of civilization, there has been an evolution of working conditions, laws, methods, and pay. Let's look at the Egyptians, for example. Slavery was used in order to build one of the greatest architectural designs in the world, the Pyramid of Giza. Unlike today's world, where something like Facebook was made by less than 10 people in a college dorm room, this is an extreme difference in work and payoff, but there is a huge time gap between these two events. What happened in that time? Some of the most evolutionary events in the history of labor were between 1865 and 1928, and there were many changes, whether good or bad, that led up to where we are today. The abolition of slavery, the change in working conditions, the gross use of child labor, and the formation of labor unions. Each one of these aspects changed labor in some way or another.
First off, let me tell you a little bit about the slave codes, which basically gave slave owners absolute control and lasted up until the end of the Civil War. Slaves were prohibited by law from learning to read or write. A slave was just a piece of property, a source of labor, to be bought and sold just like an animal. Slaves were denied a rightful share of economic, educational, social, and political progress in the United States for over 200 years. The life of a slave was so horrible that in some cases mothers even killed their newborn children, claiming to be saving them from the life of slavery. During the period of slavery, only about 1/10 of blacks were free. In 1860, there were almost 500,000 free blacks, half in the South and half in the North. In the South, free blacks were seen as a threat to slavery. In the North, free blacks were discriminated against in such rights as voting, property ownership, and freedom movement. Though they had some access to education and could organize, free blacks also faced the danger of being kidnapped or enslaved. Things were all supposed to change when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863. This document declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free, although it only somewhat affected the states that seceded from the Union. As a result of the Union victory in the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, nearly 4 million black slaves were free. After the Civil War, with no land and not many jobs, blacks moved in search of work. They generally lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Because of this, the southern states took advantage and enacted laws resembling the slave codes. These laws restricted the movement of former slaves in an effort to force them to work as plantation laborers at absurdly low wages. This was otherwise known as sharecropping. During the Reconstruction period, between 1865 and 1877, blacks wielded political power in the South for the first time. But black political power was short-lived. By means of economic pressure and the terrorist activities of violent anti-black groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, most blacks were kept away from the polls. The 14th Amendment is what gave all persons, including former slaves, citizenship to the United States. The 15th Amendment is what led up to blacks having the same rights they have today.
During this time period of Reconstruction, many people were searching for a job. Many of these people would do anything just to get by. Many of these jobs included working in mines, on the railroad, and in factories. These jobs required hard work and were very dangerous. Many of the precautions that should have been taking place were looked over. Industrial safety was a large issue. Factory work was very dangerous, and it was difficult, if not impossible, to hold factory owners responsible for deaths and injuries which occurred often. Around the year 1900, 25 to 35,000 deaths and 1 million injuries per year occurred on industrial jobs. Fires, machinery accidents, train wrecks, and other misfortunes were common. These caused many of the deaths that occurred on the railroad, which were especially dangerous. No federal regulations of safety and no enforcement of state or local safety regulations existed.
My grandfather told me many stories of how he would go to this horrible job every day. And the day he arrived in America, he was not sure how he was going to support his family. He and his family kind of scoured the city for looking for jobs. He found this job that he was in a factory. He explained to me how he just hated going to this job so much because of the working conditions that they were presented with. He would explain how the product that was there wasn't clearly cared for or stored properly. And on an everyday basis, people were getting sick. And it was so bad at one point that people were even dying on the working floor due to diseases.
These harsh conditions were not limited to adults. Children labor workers were a common occurrence, and sometimes they were in even worse conditions than the adults. By the 1900s, approximately 1,750,000 children, or 1 out of every 6, had wage work. Child labor was popular for a variety of reasons. Children were often worked 12 to 16 hours a day. First off, child labor was cheap, usually less than 20 cents per day. This is the equivalent to $2.69 a day in 2014. Only 140 cents a week, the same as $20 a week. Children that did work often worked in order to help out the family with income. Since moving from another country, many people started with nothing. Child labor was also used because children were able to fit into smaller spaces, which was good in coal mines, and children did not take up as much room as adults, which was good in factories where space was limited. Children were also more obedient than adults. I personally never went through anything so horrid, but I remember my great-grandfather often told stories about the terrible conditions presented at the factories. He showed us scars and missing appendages from the misuse of the machines. He said that he did it to keep his family going. He was only 12 at the time.
After these events were the creation of labor unions. A labor union is a band of workers who bargained over pay and better working conditions with either one or multiple employers. Workers who are in a union have Samuel Gompers to thank. Samuel Gompers was a cigar maker in England who organized the American Federation of Labor in 1886. The AFL was a decentralized league in which each member union was autonomous, but this national organization had little formal power. In its beginning, however, its craft-specific character proved to be better suited for organizing workers than its loose alliance of its predecessor, the Knights of Alliance.
Labor contracts are an important aspect of the American workforce, as many companies farm out portions of their workload to contractors who provide needed services. Labor contracts vary by individual company and specific responsibilities, but all must consist of general guidelines that includes description of duties, the length of the agreement, and the type of payment that will be made, and risks of the contractor undertaking the project. Yes, typically the first information a labor contract details are the duties that are expected to be met. All obligations from both parties must be described in great detail, in language everyone involved can understand. One misspelled word or misinterpreted phrase can result in a job not being performed as desired or a contractor's expectations failing to be met. Some labor contracts also consist of outs for either party, and these should be well defined as well. Labor contracts must provide the amount of time in which the project is expected to be completed. This usually means a specific date or even time agreed upon by both parties before signing the deal. Occasionally, labor contracts consist of more than one project, and therefore must consist of multiple time frames specific to each job. The amount of money that will be transferred from employee to contractor is another vital aspect included in labor contracts. On top of how much, labor contracts often must indicate the day on which the payment will be made or days in the event of multiple payments. Expenses for supplies and the type of supplies that are to be purchased also must be detailed in the labor contracts, as should advance payments made by the contractor. Every labor contract needs to contain potential risks to the employer and contractor. Risks often include potential injuries, damage to the contractor's property, or other hazards of undertaking a job. Most contractors understand the risks of their job, but this aspect of labor contracts need to be spelled out in great detail to protect the company and worker.